This kind lady has agreed to time. I'm sorry, I haven't been acquainted with her yet. So if anybody else is keeping time, please keep your timers in silence so that there's just one time that everybody's following. Okay, let's go. I now invite the Prime Minister to.
Come on, Jay.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the ability for us to attain social justice for individuals within our state is an inherent duty, especially for an individual who had the ability to access the right to vote. Oftentimes we believe that utilizing that power to vote is an inherent privilege that individuals need to be able to comprehensively utilize to ensure that justice can be meted out. What is this debate about? We will argue from opening government that this debate is about your principal position as a voter and what you then prioritize in the times of election and how you then best move forward in this debate. We will argue that our stance is that as a voter who believes in these values, you have a duty to fight for social justice and social good. We would win that debate. So what is the context of the world in many different countries, right? We will argue that there are tacit as well as implicit discrimination that exists against minorities that exist within that country in the attainment of their specific rights. For example, African Americans from the United States of America, or even native aborigines all around the world, ladies and gentlemen. We think it is problematic, no thank you, at the point in which we treat this individual at a subpar position. I'll illustrate this a lot more later. Secondly, the world that we live in right now is that the categorization of funding that the state often employs to mobilize communities is not dispersed out evenly to every citizen within that country. Oftentimes, we think there are targeted, specific focus way in which we utilize that fund that is often centered around things that are attractive or economically viable for that country. We think oftentimes the subjective notions of what is important for individuals within different considerations as well as the different needs of individuals in the communities are often sacrificed via this objective determination of what is good for the country. So firstly, let's evaluate this value system of this particular individual. So this person who is socially, or who believes in socially liberal values, will want to fight for things like welfare and the right for you to access your rights as a specific individuals, i.e. things like the access to state institutions for racial and social minority, the right to be recognized that my sexual identity as well as my racial identity is an inherent right to me and should not be subjugated under economic benefits, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, we will argue that you have to ensure that this position isn't contradicted to other policies or other values that exist within status quo. Oftentimes, these two values that you believe in are in direct contradiction to one another. We think that you can't support things like allowing for welfare to exist, whilst at the same time fighting for things like welfare cuts, especially in times of economic recession, ladies and gentlemen. Oftentimes, you always have to be that calculation that we will have to sacrifice one over the other. Therefore, we think that in the goal of attaining rights and social justice, as well as propagating a movement that allows for cohesive and comprehensive attainments of rights, we think you have to make a realistic decision as to what I will prioritize in times of elections. So firstly, let's look at the idea of that responsibility of that voter. But before I move on, I'll take a point. Yes.
This person already believes in these two sets of contradicting beliefs. What is the possible link between these two?
Okay, the position that exists in status quo oftentimes is that people often buy into the rhetoric that an objective evaluation of economic development is for the greater good of that community. But we also believe that this individual realizes that an objective evaluation does not care for sensitive and subjective consideration of specific communities and their individual rights. So firstly, I'll deal with that a lot more later. Firstly, responsibility of that voter. We think that this person recognizes that being socially liberal, as a person who believes in socially liberal values, I also have to care for the fact that there is a collective good of community that can exist in status quo. Oftentimes, ladies and gentlemen, we will argue that socially liberal values contribute to access to all of the benefits that you can get from being fiscally conservative. For example, right, the ability for you to access the right to education or the right to welfare means that later on down the road, you have the ability to be a viable group of members of community that are labor forces, as well as not being dependent onto the state anymore. We will argue all of these rights means that as an individual in society, you are able to self-actualize in an economic manner and does not harm the country in any way. No, thank you, sir. We think that your vote is a power, and the role for you as a voter is to utilize that power, ladies and gentlemen. Because we will argue there are many individuals in the status quo that do not have the access or the privilege to access the right to vote, given the fact that they don't have things like access to state infrastructures, like education, like welfare, ladies and gentlemen. Oftentimes, these individuals are held at ransom to other societies that tell you we have an objective goal of allowing our economy to grow forward without realizing that this does not trickle down to individuals. Secondly, the evaluation of social justice. So who do we grant social justice to, ladies and gentlemen? Oftentimes, we want to grant it to people who need it the most. So these are people who are minorities or who rely on the state to allow for them to be able to access things like welfare, education, and jobs. Comparatively, we will argue at the point at which you prioritize like being fiscally conservative over socially liberal values, oftentimes we think it sacrifices the ability to have long-term calculation of what these individuals' dependency on the state necessarily means, ladies and gentlemen. We think it's more strategic for you to fight for social liberal values via your vote or who you support for, because it is more powerful that way. Oftentimes, individuals who are fiscally conservative in nature win that vote because they have the ability to argue in a rhetorical way that we have a duty to our state and we have to ensure that our economic structures is functioning. But oftentimes, we have to argue that we have to provide a counter argument to that powerful argumentation and say that the structures of economic structure right now does not cater for individuals within the subset of communities that are not targeted here. That is why development in countries all around are never at a uniform growth. That's why even in the most developed of countries like the United States of America, you still see creations of ghettos within that particular areas because people don't realize that your objective economic evaluation does not translate to other individuals in the status quo. Lastly, we will argue that the rhetoric of being fiscally conservative, being an objective good for the state, will never change. Why? Because at the point in which a country is able to move forward and achieve economic cohesion as well as like a great economic structure within that community, the argumentation then becomes, why do we need to grant you your rights, or why do we need to prioritize your socially liberal values? Because our country is doing a lot better. We think that states can often say things like possible deniability and saying that at least we have our GDP raising, you should be grateful to us, as opposed to recognizing that you as an individual deserve your individual rights, irrespective of whether or not the country is doing well. So there are two scenarios in this, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, in the scenario in which the country is able to economically flourish and be better, at this particular juncture, the individuals that you are willing to sacrifice will never be able to win the argument because the narrative is so powerful, because the economy is working well without giving your rights. But at the point in which the country does not move out of that economic jump, or they are unable to grow within that, ladies and gentlemen, we think it makes it far worse for us to be able to pivot that discussion to the attainment of rights and attainment of social justice. At the end of this debate, if you recognize the value and the power of your vote and why it's important for you to give back to a collective good, you should side with government.
Thank you, and I would like to be the opposition to turn to the opposition's bench.
The mission of opening opposition today in today's debate is to see which side can have the cake and eat it too, right? That's the fundamental flaw in OG's case. They don't believe that we can have both. we believe that the financial development is the first prerequisite to any type of societal progression in society. Before I move on to my points, a few rebuttals, right? They see these two things as socially, as mutually exclusive. They say, you know what? Sometimes say infrastructure does not mean anything if people cannot access them, right? However, we have to look at the comparative here. Like throughout the history of societal progress, people, you have to convince the majority of people in the society that social equality is the way to go before you are able to attain social equality. That is the purpose of an election, right? Where only the majority of the populace believe in your idea, that is when you are able to pursue that policy. And we believe that without social financial development, there is no way for you to attain that kind of rational individuals in society or educated individuals in society who would push for this policy in elections. Before that, yes.
Sir, will you support on your house measures like austerity measures in times of recession?
Yeah, why not? If we believe that it will not bankrupt the state, right? Now let's look at the context of this individual. This individual holds two beliefs, right? For example, we believe that there is some sort of social injustices happening in society right now, and this should be remedied. But we also believe that the current financial practices of the state will lead to the bankruptcy of the state. For example, pensions, generous pension, generous welfare, high taxes on the rich, right? And we believe that if these two things are imminent, if these two things are going to happen anyway, why should we value financial progress first? And this is where our point comes in. We believe that the financial prosperity can lead to progressive social value. Why? Simple. The Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It says that the people must have food on the table, people must be able to achieve a certain kind of living standard before they can care about the needs and wants of other people, right? So the first analysis to today's debate is how best do we shift the perspective of people on the ground to more socially progressive values. We believe that only when people do not have to worry about putting food on the table, only when people do not have to worry about paying back the debts and high taxes, that's when they can focus on other injustices in society. But also, we believe that having fiscally conservative values will lead to the state having more money to build those infrastructures like schools, like universities. They will help the populace achieve that kind of progression, or achieve that kind of educational standard, where they are able to see that social equality is the way to go, right? Like, for example, it's no surprise that in Africa, only when majority of the populace start to get educated, the practice of female genital mutilation starts to subside, right? In fact, I read this story about when this university-educated man do not want his daughter to be subjected to FGM, but only when he brought his daughter back to the village, that's when the grandmother sneakily took the granddaughter away to be subjected to female genital mutilation, which the guy objects to, right? This shows that when you have people in the society who do not have access to educational infrastructures, people in society who always have to worry about putting food on the table, that's when they are not able to see past break past the chains of deep-seated cultural practices, no matter how harmful, right? Similarly, in India, wife burning only starts reducing once people are educated on the ground and are exposed to Western values. But these are not only limited to extreme cases like this, right? For example, it's no surprise that people in Singapore, UK, they are more likely to fight for equality, fight for meritocracy, more than people in less developed states like Singapore, like Malaysia and South Africa, where they still practice a form of apartheid, where in South Africa, the president still took away lands from the whites to give it to the blacks, right? This is because when there is scarcity in society, we believe that people will always prioritize themselves first. People will always prioritize the demographic, which they feel more inclined to. Which is why when there is economic scarcity, if you are a white, you will prioritize the well-being of the white, because this means that if your community is doing well, you will do well, right? Only when people are living in a relatively okay living standard, that is when they are okay with sharing this wealth with other people, and that is what we must do. But secondly, second level of analysis, by having wealth in the state, by having people doing relatively well, that is when we empower people on the ground to fight for socially progressive values. Which is when people are doing economically well, this is when the grassroots gets funding, right? This is when your NGOs get funding. That's when people actually have free time to actually protest on the street, compared to if you are living in a state like Greece, where you have to spend your free time lining up at the ATM machine in order to withdraw money, or you have to spend your free time getting looking for employment, right? We believe that will happen under your paradigm, where your NGOs or grassroots all fighting for social inequality will not be able to fight for their socially progressive values, and the rhetoric will be hijacked by people who wants to prioritize economics along racial lines, along the demographic lines that the society most relate to, right?
Yeah.
But before I move on, yes.
As a voter, how do you reasonably argue against a state in a scenario that the state is economically developed at the expense of not giving social rights?
Like I said earlier, economic development is a prerequisite to social development. Like I mentioned India, I mentioned South Africa, I mentioned Singapore, I mentioned UK, and I contrast it to states like South Africa and Malaysia, right? Which is why you have missed the first part of my speech. I wonder why. But then we should also see that under our paradigm, the states will also have more money to enforce these policies. For example, to enforce things like the Civil Rights Act, we need strong courts. We need people be able to afford lawyers to pursue these cases in court. But for example, if under your paradigm, the people are not wealthy enough, the people are not educated enough, or most likely they're not, there are less judges or less lawyers in society. That's why people are not able to pursue, or states not able to use the resources to enforce this meritocratic and equal rights policies, right? But lastly, let's look at the agenda of a state. Only when states reach their economic capacity, that's when they begin to look into other forms of inequality of society that will lead to further the economic progress. We give the example of China, where now they've always prioritized economic development without caring about corruption, without caring about social inequality. But only now, once the economy begins to reach first digits, in fact, instead of double digits, this is when Xi Jinping now cracks down on corruption, prioritizes meritocracy, and opens up democratic representation. This is because once you see that all our economic values are working, only then you will be able to crack down on other things in society that will lead to further economic development. Right? For all these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
Ladies and gentlemen, Americans love their money. You see it in the glorification of things like Wall Street to the worship of the things like the almighty dollar. The debate then becomes, as a socially conscious person, how do I break this rhetoric in order to mobilize the rest of society for the better future of my country? With this regard, we think there was stark engagement from Leroy with regards to things like Jay brought up, with regards to the responsibility as a voter, with regards to breaking things like the executive capture of these sorts of markets and of these sort of incentive structures to create a country. And let's deal with this, right? Because essentially Leroy had one big argument, that you need money as a prerequisite for social change. We think that yes, in an instance where you're dealing in an idealistic world so therefore you're arguing in a vacuum. In status quo right now, when we've seen trends of how we've already built structures, we've already built economies, and we've already been able to forward some form of economic gain in this country. There are still things like structural discriminations, implicit discriminations, personal discriminations onto minorities because they are unable to gain access or they are unable to get the opportunity in the first place. And we think this stems from the very argument that Jay brought up. So there is a very strong rhetoric at the end of the day that we didn't need to fight for these people in the first place for a better country. That was the premise that Leroy had to break in order for him to run that prerequisite argument. Because if you're going to argue in reality right now, I'm sorry guys, then you're out of the debate. But let's deal with this further, right? Firstly, this argument that Leroy brought is premised on whether or not these policies are antithetical to one another. So we do not think you're able to fight for things like education policies, but at the same time still forward money to building schools. You're unable to levy certain taxes on corporations when you're forwarding things like anti-discrimination laws all the time. We think at this moment in time, you have to take a stance. So if the stance comes with regards to dealing damage on things like your financial institution for the sake of the minority, then we're very proud to stand on this. But for our side, we think that we are also flexible in an instant that we don't have to, that social liberal values doesn't always have to deal with things that, fiscal policies doesn't always have to come at the expense of social liberal values. We're okay with things like cutting down military spending and also funneling it as well. We think on that instance, you can also get some form of benefit on our side, so that argument falls, right? Second response is this. Because you were never able to hear in Leroy's speech, what is the incentive for these governments to actually create some change later on in the day? If you're able to use the rhetoric that we do not need to fight for social justice in order for the country to prosper, therefore we think that that's a hard rhetoric to break. Especially when it is the executive and probably the Republicans you're voting in is controlling the budget, that is controlling the money, that is controlling the allocations of those fundings to begin with. And because this is some form of a generational thing, every generation and every 4 years you're going to hear the same rhetoric forwarded by the people. That you don't need to spend so much on Medicare, that you have to build the economy instead. And we think that that's a harmful thing that you don't break. Lastly, we don't think you're able to break that rhetoric either way. This house discussion with regard to how Jay closed the argument. It's hard to pivot away from discussions and bring it to with regards to social liberal values at the end of discussions. And we think that you guys don't solve that. But what did Jay told you in a speech that wasn't responded to in Leroy's speech? Because like I told you earlier, Leroy argued in a vacuum. But if he's going to argue things like there is a likelihood that social liberal policies will still happen, then let's analyze the likelihood right now. We told you in your speech why that likelihood won't happen, because there's a lack of incentive for the government to break that rhetoric. But on our side, there's a likelihood for economic progress to happen when we give you things like access to jobs, that we give you things like access to welfare and access to education. Therefore, you're able to mobilize and you're able to get some form of economic economic income, and you're able to access things like right to job, right to business, right to commerce, and all these sort of ideas. This, at the end of the day, increases the likelihood for you to create some form of economic benefit on your side. So on that level, we think it's more likely on our side you're able to fight for both at the end of the day. And it all starts from us giving more social rights to these minorities. The perfect example for this is when the Republicans and the Democrats were at each other's throats in raising the debt ceiling. Everything was at a standstill, because they didn't want to reallocate the budget, and everything was just stuck at that moment in time. The moment they were able to raise the debt ceiling and funnel things into healthcare, things like education and welfare, only then do you see some form of change and some form of ability for these social minorities to economically mobilize in America. And we think that is the value that we're very much proud to stand for. Lastly, we think that there was misresponses to Jay's argument with regards to comprehensive growth. That sometimes societies have to focus on the good of the entire society than just focusing on the growth of one particular area. So he did engage with things like specific targeted monopolized growth in these sorts of societies that create things like income gaps and the gaps between rich and the poor. We think that the inability for these people to create their own societies and maximize together harms their ability to fight for more rights in the end. And we don't think that they managed to solve that. But before I move on, yes, closing.
When the lack of civil rights disproportionately affect people who are poor, things like mass incarceration, police brutality happening in poor neighborhoods, what's the best way possible to solve these problems?
I don't know, anti-discrimination laws. I think that's the easiest problem. But let's talk about other alternatives, right, on our side. Because we will tell you that at the moment you're voting, you empower other methods for social change. So things like courts, things like NGOs are weak on their side. Why? Because you have things like executive capture. You have things like people not being able to afford to go for courts and not being able to access the legal system. You have things like prejudice within the judicial system for things that are procedural, like substantive merits of cases, right? When you're inside the government, you empower things like courts, you empower things like the society, you empower things like NGOs to fight for your social change because you have someone on the inside. Round 6 kind of gave me this argument, right? So the moment you see people fighting for this change on the inside, that's when everything you fight for is given credence. That is when the law socially engineers society to get rid of things like personal discrimination and implicit discrimination into hiring these people in the first place. That is the purpose of creating these laws That is the purpose of the vote, because we are supposed to give people the opportunities, because it is the lack of opportunity, and without it, we don't think you can call yourself a good citizen. Proud voters and votes.
Thank you, and now invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
We have an OG for very convenient characterization. Moya's entire speech was contingent upon the state actually having money, the state actually not in a state of deficit, budget deficit and things like that. The state with sufficient amount of money to sustain its economy. With that form of characterization, we're okay then with allowing socially liberal values to be then enforced, to be then perpetrated in society. But we're talking about the flip side where there is a comparative place in this debate. In an event where the state does not have enough money, the state is at the verge of bankruptcy, the state does not have enough budget to facilitate all the progressive values at this point of time, what then do we prioritize? This debate has to occur on a comparative. This debate is about one voter and what he believes will happen in the next 5 years. Should he take that policy of the politician in elections? Right? He believes that that status quo is going bankrupt. He believes that the state has to make a choice which will then affect his future and livelihood. Mr. Speaker, no thank you. The entire case was premised upon the idea that minus that you will hurt the minority people within the particular place. They said that we will give welfare policies and things like that, right? Number one, you even hurt the economy further because this generous policy that you're talking about does not help people who are not contributing to the economy. That means the entire financial budget of the economy will go down because you are then paying money to people who are not contributing to the economy, whether socially or financially. Mr. Speaker, no stand. We say on our side, we can prove the economical progress will happen. It will happen now and then to facilitate an environment where socially progressive values can occur under that paradigm. They never engage with Levi's and Taiwan about how we shift the majority mindset, how we shift the paradigm within society, how we go to every person at this point of time prioritizes himself and whether he can put food on the table for his family, whether he can put food on his table for himself, not whether or not I should come up the Mr. Speaker. Let's do with Jay's speech, right? Because there were a lot of loopholes in her speech, right? She said, we should have these policies in elections. Like number one, she never justified why all these socially progressive values should go through elections, Mr. Speaker. They are mutually, there are things, these are things that can actually be in status quo without the need of an election. However, economical policies can only go through elections, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about things such as other methods. And in Ireland, where a referendum was held on gay marriage and the soon coming abortion. I think about USA having mass rallies on abortion and court cases like the Brown versus Ateneo, post segregation. These are things that mutually exclusive. Within status quo, we never have a justification for OG talking about why they need social progressive values to be within the election context. Never a justification for
from them. No, thank you. We tell you that economical policies such as tax reduction, such as subsidizing local industries, like how Malaysia does for cotton, how Thailand does for the wheat industry and things like that. All these things can only happen once those economical policies are agreed upon by the majority of people within states. So, no, thank you. Then she talks about how, economical policies are objective in nature. They cannot transfer to other people. But they actually can, Mr. Speaker. When your economical policies affect 1% status quo, it affects your livelihood and how you live in status quo. Meaning your relative comfortability of living is affected. At that point of time, when you're living in a very comfortable environment, when you're satisfied with the money that you make, when you're satisfied that you put food on the table, that is when you're able to think about others. That is when you can think about all the divorce policies, all the abortion policies, euthanasia, gun policies, everything is status quo, because it does not directly affect you. When something as severe as money and your livelihood affects you, at that point of time, you have to decide for the betterment of yourself, for the betterment of your family and relatives and people whom you love, not people whom you see at the streets and you don't even have a poor relation to those people. No, thank you. Then when you ask a very big heading POI, right? But I'll deal here and tell you why their case falls even then. He said, in terms of recession, will we then prioritize austerity measures? Exactly. At times of recession, that means they agree that this possibility might happen in the future. This is the thing that can happen. At that time, then you have to think whether or not you're going to prioritize your right to freedom of speech, your right to education, your right to expression as a homosexual, and things like that. Or do you prioritize increasement of tax? Do you prioritize austerity measures in order to keep your economy stable, to keep the industries running, to keep your family alive? As a speaker, we tell you at that point, like people want to get out of the economical suppressed situation that they are in. We look at an example of Greece. They had social rights but a crashing economy, speaker. Money wasn't channeled to the right place at the point of time. And then you existed, but you didn't take the austerity measures that could have helped you come out of the situation you were in. Because of that, their case falls as a whole, right? They never engaged, not that quickly. They never engaged with the points coming from the right, how to shift the mentality of people in that school, right? They say that minorities will be victimized. But at the same time, without prosperity in status quo, your social inequality wealth, economical inequality wealth is not narrowed, but it is even further than usual, right? At that point of time, we will not prioritize black communities, we will not prioritize the homosexual communities because we have no correlation with them. Secondly, you only prioritize yourself because it is your own white people that can facilitate your growth. People who are as smart as you, people who have the same form of status, same form of social income and wealth income as you. Therefore, on our side, we tell you we need an environment to facilitate the socially progressive values to come later at the expense of economical progress that we say we need now. We need everyone to be comfortable with this people. We need infrastructures for the government to build. Schools, for example, hospitals, for example. Things like this to facilitate the idea that social progressiveness can come after that point of time. Yes, please.
Given the extreme context you just set, and the fact that you contend that it's two separate values, how do you then ever break the rhetoric that you need to attain social rights when you can always argue that the economy is always more important?
Number one, you never told us what country this is happening in, right? As in, what other rights do you want? You already have rights to abortion, euthanasia coming a few months later. You have already gun policies in place and things like that. What country are you talking about? Because you give us a characterization that these countries are already stable, then what other rights do you want? You, in the event, you have to engage in the event that a crashing economy is in context. What then do you prioritize as a voter? I'll tell you why they never engaged with yours, and why we win on that point alone. The responsibility, he said, what is the perspective of society? What is the responsibility of a voter? A voter doesn't think about other people. A voter thinks about what he himself can do or can target in the event the policy passes through in the next 5 years, which will affect himself. If the economy is not doing well, or if I'm not a homosexual at this point of time, I'm not inclined to support homosexual laws because it doesn't affect me. If I'm not married, I'm not inclined to support divorce laws. If I'm never married, I'm not going to get married in the future, and I don't see myself getting pregnant, I'm not going to support abortion laws, Mr. Speaker. However, economical policies such as tax, it affects your employment, it affects your line of job, which you will be working for the rest of your life. Pension schemes, things like hospitals and things like that. All these infrastructures requires money, it requires funding, it has to be built. We therefore need the society to facilitate that growth of these economical structures and economical physical constructs. Once we have that, we have a society that is comfortable, a society that can think about other people, thereon and therefore. With all due respect, we oppose this debate. Thank you, and I now invite the member from the government bench to take.
It's really hard because I'm an economics major, so I'm not really sure about politics. But then when we were making our case, I got converted. It seems like I believe that politics is really the first step towards economics. So the point of this is we will convert you also. So let's begin. We say that when we made the Constitution, ladies and gentlemen, we first made the Constitution and then created markets after that. The reason for that is because we wanted to shape markets based on what people needed and based on what people created as an identity for that nation. For example, if you are in the Philippines, which I think this debate should really be about, it's poor, but not that liberal. So, context Philippines. Thank you. The reason for that is because if we shape the markets and then allow the markets to shape our constitutions or our institutions, that would mean that a few elite individuals with enough money would be the people controlling everyone else. So what we want to do in our extension is say that in the strategic maneuver of an identity as a voter who wants to change society, we would rather not become fiscally conservative first, because becoming fiscally conservative would mean we entrench the current structures, the current status quo, so much so that people will be enculturated and will never be able to be progressive in the future. That is our extension. And secondly, we will say, well, you'll be richer if you are socially conservative. So you can still do that. But before that, we have a couple of things that we'd like to rebut. First thing, what is fiscally conservative? Because opposition seems to be confused about what fiscal conservatism actually means. Fiscal conservative, if you're fiscal conservative, it basically means not spending a lot of money. It basically means that if I am put in a position where I can make a school for cheaper and make a school somewhere far, like a minority, a rural place, which is more expensive, I will not spend on that rural place because it's more expensive. Secondly, if you are told that you need to give welfare to poorer individuals or subsidize a big corporation, you would rather subsidize a big corporation because that is cheaper and there's more things compared to subsidizing a poor individual who has nothing to eat. So this is basically what fiscal conservatism is. It is not this whole we spend on the poor, not this whole we will give more money to the poor, because that is totally untrue. So what is the first rebuttal to us? Their case was to say that if we are really poor, becoming fiscally conservative is the way that you feed individuals. That doesn't make sense because you have austerity measures and you don't pay for welfare at all. So that means that the poor individual in their convenient context would have nothing to eat from the government. What is the likely situation of a fiscal conservative then? It means that if there is a labor surplus, like 20,000 laborers with nothing to eat, as a corporation who has government subsidy, I can just abuse 10 of them and then fire them and then get from the rest of the 20,000 who cannot eat, which means that oppressed and marginalized individuals in fiscally conservative countries are more oppressed because they have no capability or no money whatsoever to defend themselves against corporations who have government subsidies. But secondly, that also means that that doesn't make sense. How are they becoming richer if they do not spend anything whatsoever? We would argue that if you're actually a fiscal liberal, according to the economics class, the point is that you will spend more on roads and bridges, more schools in rural areas. That means that you will spend more on your people. Now, that sounds like we're just defending minorities, but actually what that means is, if I build one bridge or one road, I will have to hire like 50 people to build that road. So if the unemployment rate is really high in my country, that means not becoming fiscally conservative actually gets more money in the pockets of unemployed individuals, even if I don't give them welfare. So it's totally untrue from opposition that people will be dirt poor if you do not become fiscally conservative. Actually, spending more gets people to have more money. So if I build that bridge, I have more money to feed my family, and I don't become a burden in the state. Secondly, they say that economics is the prerequisite to getting more rights. This is insane. Economics functions with variables which it can identify. Which means that if economics does not identify a homosexual as someone we need to pay for, it will not pay for that homosexual. The point of this is that we need to expand the definition of which people we can pay for before we just say that these are the only people you can pay for. So, if you are a homosexual in the Philippines and there are no institutions to support you, we will not pay for you at all, right? We cannot pay for you at all because the law disallows us from paying for you. That is the basic of this debate, and that is why the chicken and egg argument where they try to deadlock us, the point is you need rights before you create a market. Okay, closing.
It's not about who helps the poor. Obviously, this person wants to help the poor. It's either through welfare or creation of jobs. You're not talking about the debate
Okay,
at all.
sit down. You can't even prove that you get more jobs with fiscal conservatism. You don't spend anything. You only spend it on the elite or the big corporations because that's cheaper, and they can hire in a labor surplus of 10,000 people. They can only hire like 5 of you and then fire you and then hire you and then fire you. You should expend it all. There are a lot of you who are poor who have no welfare. In our side, you also create more jobs because it's the bridge argument I said a while ago means you hire more people, therefore a lot of employment. Employment means money. Just so it's clear. Firstly, let's go with how fiscal conservatism actually solidifies progressive structure. So in this strategic maneuver identity argument, we are not saying that one thing is better than the other, but we are saying that if you put fiscal conservatism first, it will be so hard for you to transition to anything else in the future because you have spent much money in cultivating individuals with the current status quo. Why is this so? The premise is very simple. If you are a fiscal conservative, this means that you spend on traditional institutions, like schools, for example, hospitals, security, all of these other things that have nothing to do with becoming progressive. This means that if your status quo is currently racist against a minority, you will have to build a school which will teach the same racism over and over again because that is the only thing that you can pay for. You do not change your curriculum, for example, in these schools, which means that the current status quo and how you can cultivate people will be the same. In a sense, that means that if we have a comparison between a minority school and a school within an urban area, we will never spend on a minority school or a school in a rural area because that is more expensive. So that means that even if you go with their side, if you talk about welfare, that also means that elite institutions will always have power over smaller individuals because smaller individuals will never have welfare. What does this mean? What it means, ladies and gentlemen, is if fiscal conservative does come first before any social liberal identity, you will always have to solidify current institutions that you have, and you can never create other institutions during that time span. This will mean that in the current, whatever the current status quo will be the status quo up until the point in time where you can become a social liberal. Why is that problematic? It's simply problematic, ladies and gentlemen, because it enculturates all other individuals never to think about social liberalism. But the converse is easier. You can actually shift to become a fiscal conservative if you are social liberal first, simply because you already have institutions that take care of, say, minorities, which means it's easier to spend less on these minorities and easier to convince poorer individuals to spend on minorities because in the long run you save more money. So in the end, as closing government would say, it is easier to be a fiscal conservative if you have institutions because you will now spend less on things that you now have to spend less on the collateral damage that comes out from abusing these rights. Thank you.
Thank you, and I invite the member of the side conversation.
This is a classic situation where debaters think they know about all the economics policies in the world and think that this debate is about them. This debate is not about them. It's about this specific voter who, in some situation, decided to believe in two seemingly contradicting beliefs. And how do we reconcile those beliefs? What is the best way to move forward? Few clarifications. First, this frame of mind of this person. What is the possible link? If he cares about minorities and civil rights, such as African Americans and Hispanics and their rights to vote, for example, and their rights to have education, it's also likely that they also care about whether they have food or not. It's ridiculous for them to just assume that because I care about, because I'm a fiscal conservative, therefore it inherently means that because government don't spend, I subject everyone to hunger and poverty. That's not true, because this debate is not about what's objectively true, and this is not an economics debate. It's about believing that you already believe that fiscal conservative sit is better, meaning that you don't believe in welfare, but you believe in the empowerment through other measures, such as higher taxation, such as lesser expenditure, which won't drive you into the deficit that you have to loan a lot of money and therefore reducing your credit ratings, or things such as not imposing stimulus which drove the US into the housing bubble, for example. So this is not the economics debate. This is about what you believe and how do you move on from there. Sit down. No. So how do we reconcile that? Secondly, okay, aside from what opening opposition have already argued, that only when you have money and only when the country is economically empowered, then can you move forward. In closing, we'll talk to you about something on the larger scale. Firstly, we'll compare, like, obviously both sides want people to be empowered. Theirs is essentially a top-down approach. They argue that they want governments to, grant rights, civil rights to people. We want people to be empowered first, and therefore it's a bottom-up approach. Why is the bottom-up? Better we take this debate a step further. Secondly, I'll talk about the people affected. Why should we care about more people who will be objectively affected? No, thank you. Now, more rebuttals. So, I just want to call that CG completely. We have told you. So let's rebut them together. Firstly, economics is already developed. Therefore, no, sit down. When you talk about countries, even the most developed such as the US, the lack of civil rights disproportionately affect people who are living in neighborhoods such as Ferguson, who don't have access to employment, who don't have access to education, who are subjected to mass incarceration only because they have to steal because they don't have money to survive. Those are the kinds of crimes and poverty that you subject them to because of poor economic policies. You're talking about the lack of access to education when 1 in 4 college goers that goes to college in US are unable to pay their education and therefore have to drop out of college. When 1 in 4 are not able to pay for their medical bills, those are the people that you affect. So regardless, even if you're talking about things such as gay rights, such as women's rights and African Americans' rights, which seemingly does not have nothing to do the economics. If you are a poor African American, you are much more harmed than you are if you are a poor African American. So this argument is entirely false. Thirdly, they say if you focus too much on economics, then it becomes a constant rhetoric and forevermore we will never care about civil rights. That's not true. Progress comes instead. What do we achieve? First, when countries become richer, that means they have money to employ lawyers. That means people have time, like what Leroy told you, to go on the streets and demonstrate, to call for rights, right? When lawyers say, it's easy. When discrimination happens, let's make laws to protect them. I'm sorry, these people don't have money to employ lawyers. They don't have the money and ability to go to court and ask for their rights before I move on closing.
Okay, if you do have money in your self-respect certificate, will you ever spend that money for anything?
You won't because you're fiscal conservative. But you will go for policies which, according to these voters, you believe benefits everyone. Things like examples which I told you about. Don't try to make this an economic. Now, I'll give you an even if to make the judge's life easier. Like even the argument is later on. But before that, no thank you. Let's compare this top-down, bottom-up approach. They want top-down legislation, laws, making rights attainable to everyone. We want to empower people economically first. Why is opposition better? On the first level, when you are richer and when you have the ability to ask for your rights, that means on the first level, you're not dependent on political dynamics to decide whether you have those rights or not. You're not dependent on which government is elected. You're not dependent on whether there's enough African Americans to form a big enough voter bloc to effect policies. That means it's much more easy to immediately move our poverty, to immediately have the money to pay for college, to pay for medical benefits, and those are the things. Secondly, it's much more efficient, right? If you have to wait for court decisions, if you have to wait for legislature, if you have to wait for the Republicans and the Democrats to debate about policies which take years and not resolved, it's much, much faster for you to get rich first and escape yourself from the poverty first. And when you talk about things such as civil rights, these are very urgent matters. These are things such as not having money to pay for your bills, not having money to go to college when you are 17 and therefore miss that golden time when you are able to attain social mobility. This is why, from a bottom-up approach, it's not only not dependent on politics, it's also much faster, which we think is way better. But even if these two things are mutually exclusive, even if you really are going to subject minority to some kind of harm if you're fiscally conservative. Why do we still want to go for money first? Not because I'm Chinese, but more importantly, money affects everyone. Social values affect some people.
Yeah.
When everyone in the country can benefit from a policy and only some can benefit from another, of course, the numerical viewpoint is much more rational for you to care about everyone who will be affected. But more importantly, on the second level, social values can be morally ambiguous. People can still debate about a lot of things, whether welfare are objectively good for people or not, whether free Medicare and Medicaid is objectively good for people or not. But when good economic policies are objective, it's about numbers, it's about GDP, it's about people getting jobs. That means it's a far more rational decision. Even if these two are contradicting, you have to make the money first to move yourself into mobility, to move up the social ladder. We're very comfortable.
Thank you. I now invite the whip to first debate on governance.
I think we've all agreed that this debate is not a basic social liberalism versus fiscal conservatism debate. The actor we are talking about wants as much as possible to have both values upheld. And while we would concede that in the short term the two values are contradictory, the winner of this debate will be the team that showed how the two values can be in unison in the long term. To that, we extended on 3 fronts, which side closing opposition didn't even bother to respond other than saying it was a rehash. What exactly were these? First, the reason why social liberalism and fiscal conservatism seem to be contradictory in the first place is because fiscal conservatism strengthens oppressive structures. Thus, prioritizing liberalism now attacks the root of the contradiction between the two values. Secondly, even if we assume both trade-offs are valid, we discuss why social values must always be prioritized over economic because it covers a broader base of rights and identities that sometimes money can never really be able to protect you from. And thirdly, we told you that we can still create a mass amount of wealth even amidst bankruptcy or even amidst all of the harms that they were talking about with a poor state. Given that, I have 2 issues I want to discuss in this debate. No, thank you. First is about the opening opposition's idea of fiscal financial development as a prerequisite for social liberalism, which is the premise of closing opposition as well. And secondly, I'll deal with closing opposition's idea of the bottom-up approach and caring about more people. So firstly, is financial development really a prerequisite before social liberalism? And this is the main problem really with the entire opposition bench. Because they basically equated fiscal conservatism, meaning financial development, without ever really showing the link. Why exactly would you have more wealth just because you have fiscal conservatism? Will you really be improving your standards of living? Especially when it has been shown even across the bench in government that sometimes, for example, when you have fiscal conservatism in the case of austerity and bankrupt states, you aren't able to overcome that, like in Greece. Or sometimes they aren't able to have more jobs in the market in the first place. So no, it doesn't mean just because you're fiscally conservative, you want a better standard of living. But fine, what we extended further was that even if you can see a level of financial development, the ones who are developing are the economic elites, precisely because the money does not trickle down from the state. You are expecting the companies, the big conglomerates, to be the ones who trickles down this money and provide you jobs. But we know that's unlikely, precisely because they find you as expendable. So given that no one else will protect you aside from the state, we think it's very wrong for the state to become oblivious in this situation on opposition bench. We need to only further entrench the elite with that type of fiscal conservatism. But on the third level, we'd say is that let's assume they are financially developed under their model. Will they really have an incentive to fight for social liberal values, therefore, in the future? Especially what happens under their model is that they tell you that it is going to be always effective to be fiscally conservative. That's the reason why you become financially developed. People have no reason therefore in the future to ever want to spend on minorities, to ever want to spend on things like schools and hospitals, precisely because you've always been entrenched to the idea that fiscal conservatism is the way to go. That you shouldn't spend at all on people, you shouldn't spend at all on minorities. That's why we don't think you are ever going to be able to mobilize individuals under their model to fight for the social liberal values that you want. That's why what we would say is comparatively, what Apple was telling you was that it's easier to change a budget in the future rather than changing people's minds. Because because people's minds are always internalized and entrenched. So it's very hard, for example, to convince people to be socially liberal in the future once you've already been entrenched in the idea that you shouldn't spend at all. But at least it's a lot easier, for example, to change a budget where you're telling people that it is better to spend on this specific sector rather than easier under our model. But before I move on with it.
Greece was both socially liberal and financially progressive. As a result, it became bankrupt. I'll give you examples on how these two can come hand in hand when the majority realizes the need to progress together. Deal with our case.
Okay, Greece became bankrupt because they weren't able to handle their debt properly. They weren't able to even pay taxes in the first place. Thus, regardless if you're fiscally conservative or socially liberal, Greece was bankrupt precisely because they had a bad government in the first place. Not because of the bad being processed. Bring us up to the need of this debate. Secondly, on the idea of the bottom-up approach and caring about more people. Because coming from closing opposition, they firstly told us that poor economic policies creates crimes in the first place. Two levels of response. Firstly, while we would agree that poor people want to commit more crimes precisely because they are poor, we show that you can still escape that under our model. Because I was talking about how you can still be able to gather wealth, even if you are a socially liberal society. Why exactly is that? Firstly, you pump more money into the market, meaning you're paying for a lot more services, allow people to get more jobs, to have more opportunities now to go to things like school, for example, or what have you. That means it's easier for you to even find an education so that you aren't going to go to the trap of always having a level of crime. But the second level we would say is in the POI we raised the closing opposition, it's not as if they will still protect these poor people who commit the crimes, because they're not even willing to spend on the lawyers. They said precisely, no, we aren't going to spend the money we possess. What exactly therefore happens with the wealth they're going to accumulate inside closing opposition? You can say that fiscal conservatism is about preserving a lot of wealth. What exactly is that wealth for? They never really showed us across the bench what happens with the money you preserve from fiscal conservatism. Secondly, no thank you. On the idea that you will become dependent on the state because you have no more money. Again, on the first level, the question is, will you really have no money at all under our model? It's not as if you will, maybe perhaps you will have less income because you pay more taxes to the state under our model. But at least you're able to get that income back precisely because what the state provides you are more services. In the form, for example, of infrastructure of roads, so it's easier for you to travel to the areas that you need, for example. In the form, for example, of schools and hospitals, which allow you to be protected from yourself. What we would say on the converse is, in times of economic turmoil, your rights are the ones that will assure you stability. Because economic turmoil can exist on either side, but money will not be able to protect you all the time under their model. Comparatively, when you have the right not to be discriminated, when you have the right to be protected as a minority group, it is easier for you to be safe. It is easier for you to be protected. And that's what we extended further on side closing government. We told you that money can't buy everything. That sometimes you need to prioritize politics and social values precisely because they cover the intangibles that money will never be able to protect. The ability to be protected from discrimination, the ability to feel welcome within its community, which you can't necessarily just buy with the money that you are being presented on by closing opposition. That's why we think the better way to be not dependent on the state is to make sure that you have the ability to have your own rights protected in the first place. And that's only possible when you prioritize social liberalism first. We're proud of it.
Thank you, and I now invite this opposition with the last speech.
Science CG has made a very funny premise today. They say that, oh well, constitution making comes first. if you want to go back as far as constitution making, then we will argue that in America in the 19th century, trading started first. But if you want to go that far, then we might as well debate about dinosaurs as well, because we started way back, and then the dinosaurs came before the ape. But if we do that, it's not fair for that, because I'm a science student, and I'll definitely win that debate. Let's move into the three main issues that we have to prove in this debate. Number one, what are the principal outcome analysis that the voter has to make? And considering in this debate is about the voter and not objective cause, which one should he or she or they prioritize, right? Secondly, and really the question that we have to answer that is like, Garth has conveniently brushed aside. Does the chicken or the egg come first in this sense? Which one affects, or is there a link between them? And thirdly, the question that we have to understand, based on this voter's perception, which fellows it affects most people out there that he or she can make with only one vote. Let's move on into the first one. What are the principal outcome analysis the voter has to make? Firstly, it seems very convenient from them saying that once you prioritize the idea of social liberty, you conveniently forget you are also a fiscal conservative, and therefore you can only vote on one extreme without caring about what the impacts are. Chances are, if you're a voter who actually has consideration about both, you will pick the fiscal conservation policy that is most socially liberal as well. So this debate is more about balancing that comparison and saying which one do you want to make. But ultimately, you have to recognize this, right? But meanwhile, while these two principles seem extremely contradictory at first, we tell you that essentially there's a link between them. More often than not, the social justice that you want to fight or the voter wants to fight is the end. And the means for you to do that, like what proven on opposition bench, is more often fiscal conservation, right? So you cannot just come out here and tell me that, look, you haven't proven anything, and therefore when we say that, look, please focus too much on social liberty without focusing on fiscal conservation, the very convenient answer was it was bad government, right? This is not a debate. But let's look at it. The debate also somehow coming from side government assumes that this debate, once the choice is going to be made and it's irreversible, somehow like Singapore separating from Malaysia. We tell you that the debate has to also take into account the dynamism of the debate. Considering that the situation that the state is in now, what is the best choice that the voter has to make? You also have to understand that your choice only lasts for 4 to 5 years. It's also within the idea that if you want a long-term outcome, which policy has more long-term outcome, right? That means we tell you that in the state of the economy right now, and you have to understand in every single presidential debate, people don't care whether they fight for the LGBT, people don't care whether they fight for the poor. The most important agenda of every presidential debate that people will judge on is what is his or her stance on economy. This shows to you that once your economy is shit, your social liberty automatically takes a backseat and people always focus on your economy, right? And therefore, you continuously perpetuate the idea that the economy is okay because we're being liberal. Therefore, people will only care about the economy, and then the converse can work as well against your side. There has to be someone that's there has to be an idea that people will start focusing. So we tell you the answer that CG wants is this, right? The idea of entrenchment is false, because eventually, when the people start fighting for the rights of other people, it's only when they, as selfish creatures, don't feel threatened, right? What do I mean by that? That means you must enjoy some level of comfortable wealth before you can start caring about other people. That is why when people start fighting for the blacks, when the whites think that they are already in the previous position, that any form of affirmative action that's carried out to the blacks won't affect them. And that's why we tell you that only when people are in a comfortable level of situation where they feel that any form of social liberty policies won't affect them that much, only then are these people willing to move across and support them. So we tell you ultimately, this is a form of dynamism that you have to understand. That considering the situation that we're in right now, that the economy of most developed states that we're talking about right now, which are also fighting for social liberty, is currently in the state of having extremely high national debt. We argue to you that reducing of national debt is an objective good that can benefit everyone, and therefore the trickle-down effects will come. I'll take you up to my second issue. Let's move to the second one, right? Does the chicken or the egg come first? Unfortunately, there seems to be an idea of them saying that, look, when people start caring about social liberty, they can then care about the economy. But we tell you that that's not exactly what's happening in status quo. We tell you that when it comes to this, you have to understand that more often than not, like what opening comes to the illustration view, but further strengthened by Deborah, the economic progress are more often than not your top-bottom big approach, and your social liberty is more often than not also possible by bottom-up approach. That means you don't have to actually have fiscal, you don't actually have to have the government telling you that you shouldn't discriminate for you to not discriminate. In status quo, there are already society on the ground, even if you send them into these schools which you say are so racist, there are already NGO movements that you say exist on your side, there are already people or activists on the ground that will fight for you to stop this form of discrimination. So we tell you, you don't exactly see why is it that everything has to be done by the state. But even if you take them at the best case scenario, that this is happening in, this can only be changed when you somehow remove this idea of fiscal conservatism. Even in a liberal economy that we see right now, there is no form of social coherence, right? Out of the 43 schools that are built in the past 10 years in the New York State, 39 of them are stationed in Manhattan, NYC, or even Staten Island, but only 4 of them are built in the Bronx. This tells you that even if you want to bring in your idea of liberal economy versus conservative economy, there will always be social debt. The idea is this, that who actually better strengthens it, right? We tell you that in status quo, when the national debt goes down, more money gets opened up fiscally, more money gets distributed out to the people, because then your security is ensured, job security, your welfare, your healthcare is ensured, and therefore, liberal policies can also target the main group of people that we're talking about. Right? Considering that your vote is scarce, which one is it best to tell you that this is it, right? But ultimately, just a while more, when will people start caring? It's only when these people don't feel threatened by the policies they are advocating for other people, then only they will move into this direction that benefits the most people. But yeah, hopefully.
The motion assumes that you care for this African American individual and his longevity and his access to these rights. So why won't you then support principles that allow him to economically mobilize their education and access to jobs?
Understood, Moya. Let's talk about the third idea, which affects most people. Under both sides, you have to understand that both sides also want to take actions to support these form of minorities which are already discriminated in status quo. But ultimately, the question is also sustainability, right? Because if their side is the one that wants these people to access to all these form of rights, want them to access education, also carry out upon their rights, you have to understand what is the situation in status quo. Status quo is already putting them at a lower economic status than a lot of them, and therefore any form of change that you want to equalize the playing field has to use up a lot of money. Therefore, understanding that sustainability is one issue, whether or not your policies can have a long-term impact and can be carried out throughout a long period of time is also contingent on whether or not what are the policies that are being practiced by the state. Only when we tell you that we cut down national debt and we're pumping more money into your own people, then this is the idea that you want to say. Well, the money never should go down anyway. Wrong. The money will be precisely used for what you say, which is to build more infrastructure for the poor, which is to carry out more welfare or carry out more healthcare for the people, right? That's why we tell you that more often than not, these policies and this sustainability, if you really care for the poor, can only come on the outside. Why is it that CEO is the one that truly wants this debate? We are the first one to draw into the link that these two seemingly contradictory principles actually have a link, and therefore, in order for you to carry out any form of long-term sustainable change, you can only go on the outside when you care about money and when people feel that they're not threatened, when the heads start talking about the minorities, will these people mobilize the change that you want. And now they're proud to oppose.
We'll all see you at the auditorium.